Good morning, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History. This is going to be your daily insight into what happened in the past and how it has influenced the events of the present. So, on this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. Let's take a short look at what happened today. So on this day in history, the 12th of May, 1215, English barons served the ultimatum to King John. This eventually leads to the creation and signing of the Magna Carta, perhaps the most significant written document in modern history. So back in the day in 1215, the barons were kind of mad at the king. They thought he was charging them too many taxes. He was not giving them enough autonomy, enough independence in their particular barondoms. And they came to a realization that was essentially, hang on, the king only has power because we do what he says. If we don't do what he says, the king has no power. They sort of turned on him and said, they basically went on the equivalent of strike and said, we're not going to do anything unless you meet X, Y, Z demands. And this eventually leads to the Magna Carta, which King John eventually broke his promises about. But anyway, it's a whole nother thing. The ironic thing here being that the barons decided not to follow the orders of the king and thought that was a great thing. But if their local lords had ignored them, they would have thought that was the worst thing in the world. Ironic. Anyway, in 1789, a man by the name of William Wilberforce, maybe you've heard of him, he makes his first ever speech on abolition. The abolition, of course, referring to the abolition of the slave trade. And his argument was not on legal grounds or financial grounds or any other traditional political argument. It was on moral grounds, that slavery was morally reprehensible. Now, eventually, this went all the way down the line to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which abolished slavery in most, unfortunately not quite all, but almost all of the British Empire. So 44 years for the British Empire to go, oh yeah, slavery is not that great. It's pretty bad. Okay. In 1943, on this day, Axis forces, that means the powers that were allied with Nazi Germany in World War II, they surrender in North Africa. So there had been an ongoing battle for control of North Africa throughout World War II. Perhaps for keen historians out there, you know the name Ernst Rommel, the Desert Fox. He had been the commander of German forces, or should I say Axis forces, in North Africa, and had had quite some success, and as a result had been reassigned throughout the Reich, throughout the Nazi regime. He was not in charge in North Africa at this time. That might be one of the reasons they were forced to surrender and were eventually defeated. Now, this was quite a significant turning point in the war because it meant that there was no Axis forces, no Nazi forces outside of Europe. They had been contained to Europe. This was a significant step, and it also saw the shrinking of their control. They were definitely in retreat by this time. So that was on this day in 1943. And I thought this was just a bit of a fun fact. When The Simpsons originally premiered, which is in December 1989, Homer Simpson's age would trace him back to 1956. So this was given as his original birthday, the 12th of May in 1956, meaning that in 1989 he was 33 years old, which means I'm actually older than Homer Simpson was when he first went to air, which is pretty amazing. But anyway, and that would mean that in actual fact, in 2020, on this day, we should be wishing him a very happy 66th birthday? Yeah, a 64th birthday, I should say, which is kind of funny because that means he's actually closer to the age of Grandpa Simpson. When it first premiered in 1989, I do not think that Matt Groening, creator of the show, would have expected that it was still on the air in 2020. Now, you've probably heard me say this before, and I'll say it again anyway. do not watch episodes of The Simpsons past season 10. If there is an episode that aired after 1999, it is not worth watching. In fact, you still get some kind of dodgy episodes in season 8 and 9 and 10 as well, but definitely after season 10, nah, they're out of ideas. Everything before that is gold though, so please do enjoy. Okay, today's deep dive. I thought it would be very, very important to talk about this gentleman, William Wilberforce. Okay, now this particular gentleman was born on the 24th of August in 1759 in Hull. He was the son of a wealthy trader. Now that is actually relatively important as a fact for placing his life into context. He studied at Cambridge University, so quite an educated man, and he became friends there with a guy named William Pitt, who would go down in history as William Pitt the Younger, because there was a William Pitt the Older, or the Elder, I should say, and he would become Prime Minister. So that meant that young William Wilberforce had some friends in high places. Again, that would be influential. So what he did for 18 straight years, he was regularly introducing anti-slavery motions in Parliament. Why for 18 straight years? Well, because no one voted them into law for that amount of time. However, his continued introduction of these laws got them publicity. He campaigned, he raised awareness, he talked to people on the street, he helped with the passing out of pamphlets, books. He held rallies. He had citizens signing petitions. It was not just a thing that was contained within the Houses of Parliament. He was very, very public on this issue. And in 1807, the slave trade was finally abolished, but this did not free those who were already slaves. The 1807 law said you're not allowed to trade in slaves. Pretty much it was no new slaves. Anyone who's actually still a slave can't help you. Okay, so a very, very big step with the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, but did not actually solve the entire problem. So not until 1833 an act was passed giving freedom to all slaves in the British Empire. Now, by that time in 1833, he had actually retired from politics 8 years earlier in 1825, and he died on the 29th of July 1833, shortly after the act passed through the House of Commons, but unfortunately before the act actually went into official law. But he still would have been relatively happy to see that it was on its way. Now, in terms of this particular gentleman, in 1780 is when he first became a member of Parliament. Keep in mind, he's born in 1759. So at age 21, he has become a member of Parliament. Very, very young man. He had a group that he would associate with called the Society of Friends. They were also sometimes known as Quakers, and they had campaigned against the transatlantic slave trade for many years. Now, he attended a lot of their meetings. He was quite associated with many of their members. And in 1783, this particular group presented the first petition to Parliament. And in 1787, with these other two particularly relevant leaders, Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp, Google them, please, they founded a new committee called the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Okay, but we are talking about William Wilberforce, and it was, in fact, he that they had selected because they needed someone in Parliament to rally for the cause. And this was the gentleman for the job, William Wilberforce. So what we need to understand is William Wilberforce did not necessarily come up with the invention of the abolition of the slave trade. There were many, many, many others who were working towards it. They just were not in a position to present laws to Parliament, whereas William Wilberforce was. So he did not invent the idea that slavery was bad. He was brought into the movement. In fact, he was actually initially reluctant. He was a little bit like, oh, I don't really want to present this in Parliament. I may not get re-elected. But eventually he saw the moral side of the equation And it was on this day, the 12th of May in 1789, that he made his first anti-slavery speech in Parliament. Kind of a big deal. So what ended up happening is his first bill, the first time he actually, so he made speeches from 1789, but he wasn't actually able to get a law or proposed law to the floor until 1791, and it was defeated 163 votes to 88. So almost at a 2-to-1 ratio, people saying, no, 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 we'll keep the slave trade, thank you. Slavery is a good thing for Britain. This was because a lot of conservative members of parliament had investments in the slave trade. They didn't want it to end. When we say they had investments, they were making money off of the slave trade, whether they were invested in companies and who were actually doing the trading themselves and they just made the profits off that, whether they owned slaves themselves, whether they were involved with plantations, perhaps they were involved with the import of sugar or tobacco, or other cotton, other particular trading goods that relied upon slave trade. There was a lot of money involved. So essentially, you've got this gentleman, William Wilberforce, who is making these speeches and these arguments to Parliament. It's really, 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 really wrong that we do this. And at a 2-to-1 ratio, Parliament turned around and said, you may be right, but I'm making bank, so I'm pretty cool with it. I'm not a slave, and I'm making money, therefore slavery is fine, which is reprehensible by today's standards, obviously. But eventually, the abolition of the slave trade bill was passed in the House of Lords, 41 votes to 20. So you can see that has flipped that 2-to-1 ratio. And in the House of Commons, 114 to 15 voted for this law. So you can see in 1791, 2-to-1 ratio of people going, I'm making money, slavery's fine, thanks. By 1807, yes, a very, 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 very long time, only 15 people thought that the slave trade should stay as a particular legal entity in the British Empire. So that is a huge turnaround. That is an example of persuading people, changing public opinion. And when you think about it, this is people voting against their own economic interests. And knowing that doing so might get some of their backers, some of their funders on the wrong side, if you will. But knowing that on the moral stance of this issue, it was better to vote to abolish the slave trade. This is actually quite a significant moment where laws start being made based on what is morally and ethically right, rather than just the best way to make money for the empire or the best way to build houses or the best way to do this. They start thinking about the moral and ethical implications. That may seem pretty obvious to us now, but that wasn't always the case, okay? Now, I do want to just point out, though, it wasn't until the 28th of August, 1833, that the Slavery Abolition Act was given the King's Royal Seal and came into law 1 year later, 1834. So they had abolished the slave trade. You couldn't buy and sell slaves, but they hadn't abolished people having slaves until 1833. The first idea was, what we'll do is we'll ban the trading of slaves, and that way it will phase out gradually because no one can get new slaves as their slaves become too old to work, or maybe they become sick or ill or whatever it may be. They can't replace them. They're going to have to start paying them, or they're going to have to hire other laborers, and slavery will sort of phase out. That was at the time thought to be the best way of doing it, rather than just saying no slaves at all, and that causing this sort of chaos in terms of the supply chain and all those other factors they were trying to take into consideration. So by 1833, they said, well, the slave trade sort of has resulted in fewer slaves across the empire. So now we can say that's it, no more slaves from this point, and it wouldn't be as detrimental. However, this particular law, and I know this didn't happen on this day, but I just think this is worth noting. This particular law, the Slavery Abolition Act, was actually called an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, and for compensating the persons hitherto entitled to the services of such slaves. And that is the second part of that huge title that I want to focus on, the compensation of the persons hitherto entitled to the services of such slaves. Essentially, what about the slave owners? Those poor slave owners are going to lose a lot of money. We better make sure they're taken care of in this law. So the first part is the emancipation of slaves, good. But the second part is making sure that those slave owners get a lot of money for being kind enough to give up all of their slaves, which is, again, rather interesting. So under the terms of this act, the British government raised £20 million. Now keep in mind, this is 1833. So that is the equivalent of £16.5 billion in 2013. So by 2020, sorry, that was the date for which I could get the most accurate calculation. But by 2020, that's probably up to about £17 billion. So they raised £17 billion to give to slave owners because they're going to be so disadvantaged by giving up all of their free workers. Oh no, they're going to have to start paying their workers. We better give them a lot of money then. Yeah, that's right. Things were different then. Okay, now I really want to put this into perspective. In 1833, £20 million was 40% of the Treasury's annual income, or essentially 5% of the British GDP, gross domestic product. Now, that would be the equivalent of £100 billion today. Okay, this would be huge. Okay, now I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago there was this thing on the side of a bus about how we could save £350 million for the NHS, and that was a very convincing argument. Now that was 350 million. Then they thought 350 million pounds would convince people. This would be the equivalent of 100 billion pounds. Can you imagine today a politician saying, listen, we want to give all these rich people 100 billion pounds, and the reason we're doing that is because they're going to have to start paying their workers, which is a little bit unfair to them, so we're going to give them all this money. That's crazy. Okay, that is an absolutely crazy state of affairs. Now this, I thought, was absolutely amazing in terms of this particular fact. To finance the payments, in order to get all of this money, because they don't just have all this money lying around, even though they are the British government, they take out a loan. And they took out a loan, so they needed 20 million. They took out a loan for 15 million. So the majority of the money, okay, with a banker by the name of Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Rothschild is definitely going to come up in on this day. Very, very powerful family, the Rothschilds. But they take out this loan for 15 million pounds. Now keep in mind, 15 million pounds is a lot of money. What would that be? The equivalent of about 11 billion pounds today, something like that. And the money was not paid back in full with all of its interest payments until 2015. So technically speaking, the British government was still in some way, shape or form paying off slave owners until 2015. That is amazing, and that is probably one of those things they're not going to teach you in school, except, you know, we just did. But anyway, I hope that is as groundbreaking, eye-opening, and shocking to you as it was to me. But it is also important to know. Okay, so the point of today for On This Day was, on this day, the 12th of May in 1789, was the first speech made by William Wilberforce in Parliament saying we should get rid of slavery. So let's focus on the positive here. This was the start of a movement that would benefit millions of people. Okay, so with all of that said, I hope you've enjoyed this particular deep dive, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.